Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. In this episode, we speak with Andrew Krinks about his recent book, White Property, Black Trespass, Racial Capitalism, and the Religious Function of Mass Criminalization. Andrew Krinks is an independent scholar, educator, and organizer based in Nashville, Tennessee. In this discussion, Krinks goes into the religious function that the mass criminalization of Black, brown, and dispossessed people serves within the racial capitalist system. Engaging with Marxist and materialist explanations, as well as Christian theologians and bourgeois philosophers, Krinks gets into how police and prisons are tethered deeply with religious ideology, which also finds quarter within the so-called secular theorists who provided the political philosophical underpinnings of the capitalist system. We also get into dynamics of race-making and racialist thinking by way of folks like Cedric and Ruth Gilmore to examine the connection between race-making and property relations. This book is really interesting and I highly recommend it. This is part one of a two-part discussion we recorded on it. If it sounds interesting to you, you can pick it up from Massive Bookshop, who of course uses their revenue from book sales to bail people out of jail. I'll also note that we hosted a video conversation with Milena K. Lamb and Tia Trafford about the philosophical underpinnings of police power this past year. It has some important areas of overlap with this discussion as well, but focuses a bit more on European secular philosophy and policing. A couple quick things coming up. Starting on Monday the 6th, we'll be hosting a new live series on our YouTube channel with Mtume Gant, who among other things is a filmmaker, media critic, and professor of film, where we will be talking about Cedric Robinson's book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning. So if you like this conversation, I think you'll find a lot of resonances with those discussions as well, as they really go into how and when race-making processes are instrumentalized in the media using historical examples. Lastly, it is a new year and we have a ton of new content coming out this year. In 2024, we published 115 videos and 38 audio episodes. We hope to be similarly productive again this year. But in order to do that, we do need your support just to be able to put the amount of time necessary in to get all that work done. You can become a patron of the show for as little as $1 a month. We should have another study group starting up in February, and that is open to all of our patrons as well. So head over to patreon.com/millennialsarekillingcapitalism and kick in $1 a month or more to that effort. Now, here is part one of our conversation with Andrew Krinks on his book, White Property, Black Trespass. Andrew, thanks for doing this. Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's talk at first about where this book's idea comes from for you, and it might be an opportunity, obviously, also to talk a little bit about, yourself and your own, kind of journey and where this comes in for you. But it was interesting. Like I recently had this discussion on the video side. We released it as an audio episode as well with Kali Akuno, where we talked a little bit about the recent elections and the popular support of carceral policies by the electorate in many cases, but particularly in California, there were a couple of bills, and one of them was like increasing punitive drug sentencing, and the other one was this question of whether to basically amend the state constitution to remove the provision that allowed for slavery of incarcerated people. And, sort of aside from the question of whether that type of amendment actually would change the prison labor regime and the reality for incarcerated people in California that much, I think one of the things my friends and I felt was that wasn't what people were voting on. They were actually saying no, like this thing that sounds terrible, like to a lot of us, like we're for that. We don't want to make prison any less. We don't want to reform the institution so that it's less punitive or labor intensive or whatever for prisoners. And so his response was just sort of like, you want my honest answer? To which I said, yeah. And he said, you live in a Christian country. And he went on and explained a little bit more about what he meant. But this really like made me go to, and you had sent me this book and I'd been, wanting to get to it, but I was like, you know what? That's right. That's why we need to read this book and think about this. So your book is about this kind of exact relationship, a relationship between deep carceral attitudes in the United States in particular, although it does talk about a kind of more general idea of like sort of Western liberalism, political liberalism, and the nation state and things like this, and the religious function that mass incarceration and policing serve within these kind of institutions and order. And so say a little bit about how you got here. Like, how did you get to this as the thing that you were like, this is what I need to study, and this is the function that I'm looking at with these ideas.
Mm-hmm. So in the book, I begin in my preface by narrating a bit further back before I was thinking critically about any of these things. When I was a child, I grew up in South Jersey, outside of Philadelphia, in a kind of semi-rural, semi-suburban context in the late 80s, early 90s. And I grew up in the church in a kind of conservative Protestant evangelical context. And that was very much a part of my upbringing. And I kind of, in the preface, I reflect a bit on the fear that was a part of my childhood. I was kind of a bit of an anxious child. I still kind of have anxiety into adulthood, but I have more tools to deal with it now than I did then. But I reflected upon how I think that, we used to watch the Philadelphia news every night, around dinner time. And, if you know anything about local news in the 80s and 90s, it was a lot of racialized fear of, non-white Black criminality. And so I think that I was kind of raised in that context of fear of the bad guy, which a lot of people, especially white folks, are raised with a kind of fear of people who don't look like them in a kind of criminal sense. And, at the same time, I'm in a context where I'm hearing about a thing I should be afraid of in a more kind of existential level, or even cosmic or kind of religious level, which is fear of hell. A lot of my religious upbringing was around what we do to avoid going to hell when we die. And so, as I look back from where I am now and what I've studied in the last decade plus, I think that those kind of dual fears were meaningful. And also that I, like a lot of kids who grew up like me, into cops and soldiers as to good guys. And so while it's easy to maybe dismiss that stuff as just kind of child's play stuff, I think that for me, in understanding why I've devoted so much of my life to trying to understand police and prisons and race and these things in a religious key, I think I have to go back to that early context for myself. And so, I grew up with these fears that I think are very much interwoven with each other: fear of hell, fear of criminality in our midst, racialized criminality in our midst. And when I am to the place where I'm getting ready to apply for grad school here in Nashville, where I live now, I was kind of involved with folks who are experiencing homelessness in a nonprofit capacity at a street newspaper. So I was hearing a lot of stories from folks about how they were being harassed all the time by police for just simple life-sustaining functions. And meanwhile, I'm also studying kind of the history of Christian theology and ideas about sin and salvation and punishment. And so kind of in the midst of all of that, I started asking some questions about, could we understand what police and prisons are about if we better understand some of what these kind of bedrock ideas of Christian faith are, at least in its primary kind of trajectories, around what sin and salvation and the like are all about. So, I kind of have this kind of dual education that's taking place at once. One, as a kind of activist and organizer involved with movements against criminalization of unhoused people in my context here in the South, as well as at that time, the burgeoning kind of Black Lives Matter movement and the more recent iteration of the abolition movement, while I'm also in the traditional classroom reading all this stuff where I'm seeing a lot of resonance with the things that we're critiquing on the street. So that's kind of, how it emerged. One specific story too that gets into the detail about, so the book is called White Property, Black Trespass. And the property and trespass notion became particularly interesting to me when in 2013 I did a kind of a special issue of the paper that I edited for the Contributor in Nashville, sold by unhoused folks and formerly unhoused folks. And it was all about people's experiences of being criminalized. So I interviewed people about where they were, what happened, what the cops said, the experience of it on many levels. And then a few months later, was invited to talk to some service providers about criminalization in Nashville. They also invited a commander with the Metro Nashville Police Department. So I was a co-panelist with this top brass cop in Nashville. I got up and talked about, criminalization of people that I knew in Nashville, specific stories about it, how it victimizes people, how it sets them back, how it's completely, inhumane, etc. And he gets up and is like, yeah, I agree with everything you said. And we've got this great thing called broken windows policing. And I was like, oh my goodness. So he's either completely doesn't understand what he's talking about, or he's trying to, trick us all by casting the very philosophy of policing that leads to criminalization on a mass scale by equating that with a humane approach of some kind. And so when we followed up later, I was in the hallway. I was like, no, seriously, okay, there's Anthony on the heating grate in the wintertime on the sidewalk in an electric scooter. What was the offense against us all that he was committing? And he was like, I don't believe that story. I was like, okay, I have the affidavit right here. So I told him another story of a guy who was under an overhang during a storm, and he was cited for trespassing and taken to jail. An unused property, by the way. And I was like, who was he hurting when he was sitting under that shelter, the edge of a property downtown during a rainstorm? And he was like, whoa, you forgot something. There's no crime without a victim. And he essentially said, in this case, the victim is the owner of that property who wasn't there. So that man who didn't have a home to live in, trying to stay dry during a storm, essentially assaulted a person who wasn't there by being present on the property. And that kind of just sent me in the direction of, I've got to understand, what is this about property and trespass? And, I'd already kind of made the connection between the centrality of ideas of trespass and Christianity. And so, that kind of sent me in these directions of digging as deeply as I could to better understand why we have what we have and why it functions in the way that it does.
Yeah, awesome. And this, I know we'll get to this, but I just want to say that, and I said this to you before we started, but one of the things that I really love about this book is the way that you think about both the ideology and these ideas, trespass, what is in this guy's head, right? About this idea of this thing, this crime that he's created against this victim of this abandoned property, basically. But then it's grounded again in these very material things, right? And gets to, even as we'll get to, into capitalism very directly, right? Because so much of this book becomes grounded in really capitalist property relations also. But then how these, and we could argue chicken versus egg on some of this stuff, right? But how then, this connects then with these religious ideas that we have around debts and trespasses, for instance, which I know that we'll get to. But that, it really was, I really appreciate this aspect of the book. So let's start on this. Let's talk about some of these terms a little bit more. So, as you said, the title of the book is White Property, Black Trespass, Racial Capitalism, and the Religious Function of Mass Incarceration. But these terms that you're using, that you lay out, you spend a good bit of time with, particularly when we're talking about white property and Black trespass. So let's start with this discussion of whiteness and of property. You include some qualifying terms that I think were really helpful for me too in reading it and thinking about these histories of property, of private property, of course, but then there's this notion of absolutely exclusive, I think it's private property, right? Or absolutely exclusive property. I found this section of the introduction really helpful too, because I do also think that these are terms that sometimes we throw around, like whiteness, for instance, blackness, property and trespass, maybe are a little more grounded for people, but where obviously we know on certain levels what these mean, but they also mean different things to different people. And so I think spending some time to actually talk about them and look and specify what they mean within the uses that you're using and like how it's deployed throughout the book and the connections. So let's just start with that. Let's start with whiteness and property and walk through some of how you look at these terms in the book, particularly through the religious functions that you're examining and how they kind of bleed into our system.
Yeah. So anyone who is maybe read in some of the canonical texts of actual critical race theory may recognize aspects of the title as a kind of a nod, which it is, to Cheryl Harris's Whiteness is Property essay from 1994, I believe. That was a kind of a seminal text for me in clarifying some of the connections between whiteness and property. And one of the many things I got from that text, which I definitely recommend folks check out, is that it doesn't stop at an understanding of whiteness as just an identity marker in a kind of abstract sense, but that it essentially argues that you can't understand whiteness without understanding its manifestation as a form of a power to possess in a kind of quite material sense. And so I've really followed folks who want to expand on talking about race beyond abstract identity markers and really making sure we're understanding it in its deep inseparability from class as well as gender and property relations and things like that. And so a really great, one of my favorite lines that I quote a handful of times in there, well, there's two actually. One is from a theologian named Willie Jennings, a current theologian writing today, who says that whiteness comes into being as a form of landscape. And that was really clarifying for me in understanding that we're going to talk about race and whiteness, just talking about skin color, just talking about like identity position and privilege even and things like that is kind of insufficient to understand where it comes from. Because if we want to understand how it functions now, we got to understand where it comes from and how it came to be. Not just for knowledge's sake, but so that we can work to, interrogate and like materially interrogate and dismantle and things like that. But another line that kind of serves as a refrain in the book comes from Du Bois in The Souls of White Folk, where he's got this beautiful, really poetic, long passage that starts that essay, which I quote at length in the book, and it ends with this line that a lot of people, a lot of Du Bois scholars at least, and maybe people kind of proximate to Du Bois studies and kind of his work might be familiar with, which is that whiteness is ownership of the earth forever and ever. Amen. And I find that to be doing the same work that Harris's essay does, in the sense that it's describing whiteness as a capacity, kind of infinite possession. And it's no mistake that he's channeling the Lord's Prayer, the Christian tradition, that forever and ever amen is what closes out the so-called Lord's Prayer in the Christian tradition found in the Christian New Testament, which we'll talk about more maybe in a bit. I really think about whiteness in these terms. And then to get a little bit more specific into whiteness as whiteness and not just Europeanness. So, I like to ask a kind of funny question of students when I'm in a teaching capacity, which is, have we always had white folks? Has there always been white folks? And it's kind of a little bit, it throws people, which is productive, I think, because kind of like, well, yeah, but, well, maybe not. I don't know. What do you mean? And it turns out, in my studies, and, this may be familiar to folks, but that, the idea of, in the language of whiteness doesn't come into usage until the early 18th century, early 1700s. And so before that, there's Europeanness is starting to kind of consolidate as an idea that transcends belonging to individual nations. So, you could be English or Scottish or French or German or whatever, but you're not white till, the 1700s or so. And what's really important to note when it comes to this question about what's religious about whiteness is that, very specifically in the context of colonial Virginia, when the legal code starts to change in its reference from European people to white people, what's interesting is that the term was actually not European before that, it was Christian. So when the legal code would refer to a Christian, it was referring to a person of European descent. So this is kind of equivalency between white and Christian that is important to keep in mind as we understand what whiteness is. And then they start to use the word whiteness, but it's only after these, series of rebellions that saw enslaved African folks and poor European laborers kind of enter into solidarity with each other, realizing that they had more in common with each other than they did with the, ruling class people of European descent, landowners, plantation owners, etc. And so this is a kind of a narrative that Du Bois and others will talk about as a kind of where the wages of whiteness get offered to poor European folks to say, you belong more with us plantation owners than you do with the enslaved folks that you're, taking up arms with. And that fracturing of solidarity is pretty important to understanding what whiteness is, in the sense that it is, and this will help us understand a little bit later when we might talk about the criminalization of white folks too, that whiteness has always been a bit of a lie to poor folks of European descent, in that there is a certain amount of power that comes with being embraced by people of European descent and being called white, but it's only ever partial, and you can still be sacrificed by those with whiteness and property. So in other words, to understand whiteness, you have to understand it as this phenomenon that gets articulated as such in the context of property relations being contested and an effort to consolidate wealth and power. And you could even say Europeanness turns to whiteness, or becomes whiteness, articulated as whiteness, in and through acts of possession, and therefore acts of dispossession. So, Europeanness becomes whiteness through property relations, is how I might put it. And so it's why Du Bois will articulate what's whiteness. It's a capacity for ultimate possession, even if not all so-called white people are afforded it. But it is also, religious in the sense that, like I said, European Christian identity kind of morphs into white identity. So there's always a presumption of kind of moral standing, of a kind of moral hierarchy of races. Whiteness is always described in terms of, are characterized as proximate to God, whereas non-white peoples are always characterized in terms of their distance from God, in both explicit and implicit ways. Then maybe the final thing I might say about this is that in the book I develop this idea that we would do well to understand whiteness as a kind of aspiration to a kind of godlike power over people and planet. I have a little bit of a critique of people who quote Du Bois but leave off the forever never amen, because I actually think the forever never amen after ownership of the earth really helps us understand the extent to which whiteness can be understood as an aspiration to wield a kind of power that resembles a godlike power in the world. And, you got other folks, before Du Bois and after, who are also talking about whiteness in terms of trying to play God in the world. And I even go so far, farther than some of the theologians on my dissertation committee likes, to try to understand whiteness in terms, like by putting it up next to descriptions of the traits of God in like Western Christianity, as infinite, as transcendent, as invulnerable, as arising from God's self, as utterly independent, in need of nothing. Like all these traits about who God is, I actually think are pretty clarifying if we want to understand what whiteness is trying to be, and that it's trying to be something that is, invulnerable to other, human beings, as kind of claiming an infinite power, and on and on. You can check out the book for more in the weeds about that. And then, so on the property side, and we could talk more about this shortly too, but, there's figures like John Locke who come along and are building on long traditions of talking about private property that very much preceded the modern era. Private property exists in some form in the ancient era, medieval and on, but it doesn't become what we know it to be today until we get to John Locke in the 1700s. And, which I, as you mentioned, refer to as not just private property, but absolutely exclusive private property. Because prior to him, there's a sense that you can have private property so long as you still have some sense of responsibility to the well-being of other people in society around you, generally. But with Locke, you kind of shift from that towards, that the claim on property is absolute, and it's actually ordained by God and by natural order and natural law, such that it's not just an unfortunate necessity to keep the peace, like previous theologians and philosophers would say, but actually that God wants it this way, and that there's really no limit on the absoluteness and the exclusiveness of private possession. So he will riff on biblical texts to make his point about why property should be absolutely exclusive and why God wants it that way. And then finally, there are thinkers who will argue that, Locke was writing before whiteness was really in the lexicon, but he's really helping generate it, actually, without blasting it. Generate the idea of whiteness as a form of possession. And so after Locke, you can see that he was doing the work to ready the ground for that to be the case, even if he wasn't speaking in terms of whiteness yet. But yeah, that's a little bit about, hopefully that answers some, or starts to answer a bit about the question.
Yeah. And I know that we'll get to a lot more of it as we go on, because I ask, I really enjoyed, as you kind of alluded to there, but this engagement with a lot of the people that folks would call the kind of secular theorists or philosophers of the modern world, whether that's liberalism, capitalism, the nation state, so on. And I know like folks like Sylvia Wynter are really informative for me, but also they're very difficult for folks to sometimes, read and fully understand everything that somebody as brilliant as her is getting at. But she kind of alludes to the sort of mythology of this kind of secular order that is then actually still just built upon this European religious philosophy. And I think you, in this book, do a very good job of showing like some of the very particular spaces and ways that happens. So we'll get to that in a minute, I know. But let's talk before we do about the other half of the title, which is Black Trespass. And, you do discuss in the introduction again how you do deploy blackness in specific times, and particularly related to African descended people and enslaved people or formerly enslaved people, but that there's also an important category of non-white or non-whiteness which is, I understand, it's funny, I've had this discussion with people over the years. Some people really bristle when you use the term non-white because it is such a, it does exactly what you're kind of using it for, which is to draw this like demarcation basically of like there's white people and there's everybody else, and certainly obviously that flattens like all of the different nationalities and ethnicities and also, all kinds of things. But that there's a reason that you deploy that within the book, which you explain as well. And so, yeah, talk a little bit about the religious function of blackness and non-whiteness as you see them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did actually have an experience of talking to somebody who responded after I was presenting some early versions of this at a kind of conference gathering. And yeah, it was somebody who was saying, as a Black woman, they were telling me, I am a white man, cis man, and talking about non-whiteness in relation to whiteness. And they kind of said, I felt invisibilized when you said non-whiteness. My particularity was kind of flattened and erased, as you were saying, when you spoke of non-whiteness. And that was really a challenge for me to take seriously, that remark from that person and to not dismiss it, immediately. But it also led me to dig a little bit deeper in thinking about why non-whiteness is actually a pretty precise term when you think about what whiteness is. As you just said, there's whiteness and there's everything else. And that is how whiteness defines itself. And it's important here to stop and really wrestle with the fact that whiteness, not just in a category on a list of races, it situates itself as the center around which all others revolve. So it's kind of the center of gravity of all things, and yet it's also invisible in the center. It's to talk about race is to talk about everything that's not white, right? Typically when people talk about race, it's blackness and brown and Latinx and indigenous and all the different forms of identity and whatnot that are not white. But that is by whiteness's design. It's whiteness and it's everything else. And so I do say and suggest that blackness is kind of the central opposition of whiteness, and that indigenous forms of personhood are also part of the opposition against which whiteness posits itself. But that ultimately whiteness only cares about non-whiteness itself, and it cares about itself, and it cares about all who are not itself. And so, I try to take up, multiple terms throughout and to be specific about what I mean and don't mean when I say non-white. But we don't understand whiteness unless we understand it as an oppositional force, so much so that you probably couldn't have whiteness if there wasn't an antagonistic thing against which it compares itself. So, it needs an enemy, it needs an other in order to be what it is. And so it's tragically tethered to the destruction of others. It's why actually I think that whiteness and white supremacy are synonymous, basically. So whiteness to me is not just talking about an identity marker, but it's talking about a phenomenon that needs to destroy others in order for itself to be at all. And so I try to establish that early on. And so the primary other, against which whiteness posits itself as superior is blackness, which it constructs in order to make its own supremacy. And again, blackness, of course, is its own flattening of multiple, African lineages and identities and origins. And though it's certainly claimed and reclaimed as a means of liberation or a site of liberation, but it's also this, it's very much a religious antagonism, where the supremacy of whiteness is articulated in moral terms, where whiteness is the kind of Christian, Euro-Christian, civilizational identity, and non-whiteness in all its forms, blackness and indigeneity and etc., are these forms of uncivilized savagery of people who are kind of distant from moral standing and distant from God. And so, if one of the formulations that I, kind of wrote my way into and kind of conversed my way into over time was, if whiteness is a kind of a form of property or a mode of possession, then we can think about blackness inevitably as a kind of a form of trespass. And so, this resonates with a lot of the literature of folks, that I have encountered, like Baldwin and even George Jackson and others who will talk about, and Du Bois and others who talk about, to be black is to be a problem. It's to not belong fundamentally. There is no place for people of African descent, black folks, in an inherently white space and white property of this nation, United States. And so it's a playing with the kind of the difference between whiteness and blackness is the difference between property and trespass in a way. And so there's kind of an analog there and overlap there. But also trespass, ends up being a useful term just because of its religious connotations as well, where, as I mentioned before, this Lord's Prayer, which, we talked about in context of Du Bois saying forever and ever amen. What precedes that is forgive us our trespasses or debts, which, we could talk more about that. But forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those that trespass against us. So trespass is kind of a term in the theological register for sin, which is to say offense against God of some kind. And, when you go to figures like Locke, John Locke, who is basically saying when he's arguing for property as the God-ordained and natural way in its absolutely exclusive form, as the way to order society, he is going back to biblical texts, in his case of the book of Genesis at the beginning of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, and where it says that God, and commands humans to subdue the earth. And so Locke will say that's a commandment to which we are called to be obedient. And he takes subdue to mean, along with the be fruitful and multiply, it's to make industrious use of the earth through agriculture. So yield as much as you can through the earth. And that is to obey what God commands in sacred texts. And so therefore, those who are living on land in such a way that is not subjecting it to as much industriousness and fruitfulness as possible through the forms of agriculture that were emerging at the time, those who are just living on it and dwelling on it, maybe utilizing it for growing things some, but not as much as they could, they are literally in a state of disobedience to God. So this becomes the justification for the mass displacement of indigenous peoples, because their form of land tenure, and as Locke and other Europeans will assess it, is not subduing the earth and making it fruitful and being industrious with it. And so therefore their form of land tenure is illegitimate because it's disobedient to God, and therefore it's legitimate to displace them from that land. And of course, Locke is super influential in the colonization of what becomes the U.S., Turtle Island. It's one of his most interesting lines is that in the beginning, all the world was America, which is this fascinating line of kind of an theological origin story about the kind of almost, it kind of brings to mind, settler colonial contexts that people are talking about a lot more now, including Palestine, this idea of like a land without a people, this colonial myth of that. This similarly, all the world was America in the beginning, meaning like it was just kind of barren and there for the taking. This settler mythology that is at the same time a kind of religious mythology in that it draws from sacred texts of Jewish and Christian scripture. And so, yeah, all that to say that blackness and non-whiteness are these modes of trespass in a world that's made for white possession, quite simply. And so, the interesting thing about this, I just want to kind of note here, is that this is ultimately a book about police, but this is all like the work that I'm trying to do to help us understand why police enter the picture in the first place and the fulfilling of religious function. And so, yeah, to understand all of that, you got to understand this kind of starting point of whiteness and property as these kind of sacred realities that are contrasted with the profane realities of peoples who are not white and not propertied, or not property. You can be white and not property and still be an offense against this order, as we'll talk about. And lastly, on this question, I might say that it's been interesting to kind of witness in my reading over the years that the terms used to describe poor European folks in, like, say, North Carolina, the Carolina colony would become North Carolina, which Locke wrote the Constitution for, by the way. The terms that are used to describe poor commoners in rural England who are displaced from land through the enclosure movement, the terms that are used to describe people of African descent and indigenous peoples, there's so much overlap between them. we tend to think about the kind of the indigenous and African, identities as pretty closely connected when we're thinking about how white people have derided them for centuries. Uncivilized, savage, like these terms that are part of the lexicon of European, Euro-Christian colonialism. But it turns out that like they're using the same terms for like landless Europeans as well. And that's going to be important to understand that when we understand what criminalization is in its full sense.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And yeah, the whole idea of like who can possess and who can own, and this idea of as you were talking about like land, like who has, the idea that you have to make it productive or you have to improve the condition that it is on to what then is theorized as productive use of that land. And like Moten and Harney in All Incomplete do this whole kind of riff on the German concept of Usufruct, which is like basically, as I understand it or as I read it, I've gone and kind of read a few things on it. Like there's even examples of it within US law or whatever, but like it's basically in a lot of earlier uses, it was like a man can leave property to his wife if he passes away, and she can continue to own it so long as she is improving it or keeping it in a certain state. And if not, then she forfeits her rights to it, basically. But it's all based on this idea, again, of like, there are, like these, fallow lands or whatever. It's all based on this idea that like land that is not being used in some kind of productive sense. And it's fascinating, right? Because there's plenty of examples of white people that live on land that is not productive in any kind of sense of it at all. I mean, one of the things we talked about earlier on was the guy who owned the house that is a vacant, homeowner or whatever, and somebody sleeps on his porch or whatever, and they're committing a crime, But going back, that notion, those are very important ideas. And in All Incomplete, they basically posit it, right, because they also connect possession with self-possession, right? And so then, what makes white people able to take land from indigenous people is their ability to possess because of their own self-possession, and Black people, that they are not self-possessed, right? And so then they can't own anything, including themselves, essentially. So maybe say a little bit, like, because we may come to it, but this idea of self-possession, where does that come about? And what is the importance of that related to whiteness and non-whiteness?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so self-possession is crucial for Locke as well, and it's part of the foundation upon which he builds his idea of private property. So, as you're referring to Moten and Harney, I think that they're probably kind of, engaging Lockean ideas in there as well. Around the time that Locke is writing, there's this emerging, the shift of the center of all like value and thinking is the kind of solo individual, which is a bit of a transition from previous times of how people thought about people. But people become really individuals around the time that he's thinking and writing. And so, there are people who talk about the kind of possessive individualism, C.B. McPherson, among them, talking about how what Locke is doing is developing a theory of possessive individualism, where you have this capacity to possess yourself, which is it's kind of a way of talking about rationality, like European men's rationality, that you are rational and self-possessing, and that, that's what is the foundation for then being able to extend your possessiveness outwards to things outside of yourself. But there's a really interesting thing too that I learned in engaging the work of Etienne Balibar, actually a philosopher who writes a book on Locke. He argues that Locke's philosophy of property and his philosophy of human consciousness really should be understood together, in that, we see a theory in which possession is normative to personhood, meaning that people talk about being as essential to like what a person is, like, being. But in Locke, being and having are like inseparable for him in the sense of like what human consciousness is about. And so the fact that he understands personhood in terms of having and appropriating allows him to do work that like really integrates possession into what a person is. So that's all kind of abstract, but it gets concrete in the fact that he is literally an investor in the slave trade, a supporter of the enclosure movement, someone who's giving intellectual fodder for colonization and material funds for colonization. So like, we got to think about these things together with someone like Locke, that it's no mistake that he's philosophizing abstractly that a person is one who has and possesses. A person in its normative sense, not in its abnormal sense, a European man primarily. And then the fact that he's at the same time simultaneously engaging in practices related to possession as an expression of his rational European manhood. So, I think that it's important to understand those things together. And also, this kind of progressive idea, progressive in a scientific and philosophical sense, not like politically necessarily, though there is overlap, of like improvement, as you were talking about. In a very elementary sense, like capitalism grows or it dies, like it has to constantly expand and grow and increase profits, etc. And, that's why one of the key ingredients of capitalism, the enclosure of common lands, Marx locates that as one of the parts of the origin story of the formation of capitalism. So for Locke, to talk about what's normative and what a person can possess is to talk about something that's improving and always expanding outward. And it's interesting to me to note that, to kind of listen today for the ways that people still use the language of improvement in the context of like gentrification, and the counter of improvement is waste. And so, the indigenous peoples were inhabiting land in a way that was wasteful, and hence wastelands and waste peoples even. And they were failing to improve. And so therefore, as you spoke about a minute ago, that, one's claim on a piece of land becomes illegitimate when they are no longer improving it. And in the context of gentrification and, the move of capital to claim more and more property today, it's always reference to eyesores and kind of like wasted property and the different kind of cognate terms. So I think that, there's this whole web of, admittedly, I'm trying to pull together a lot of threads in this book, and it's easy to trip over myself even in trying to recount some of it, because it really are so many things that are held together at the nexus of possession and of European identity and those who exist in opposition to it. But yeah, that's a little bit more, I think, about improvement and all that.
Yeah, no worries. I appreciate it. And I also think, and we'll get to this, later on. But, as you talked about that, you made me think of, there's always discussions of blight within neighborhoods. And then this, of course, connects also to the role of policing as cleaners, which is something that you also get to as you work into the book towards the sort of modern era of policing and broken windows and things like this idea of police, cleaning away the filth and the blight, which is often very connected to property values and improvement, quote unquote, of, lands, which, it's like when people start using these terms a lot, it's like, oh, gentrification is coming to this area, we need to get some new cleaner properties in here and change the value, quote unquote, of this area. So it actually reminds me too a little bit of like in Keeanga-Yamada Taylor's book, what's it called? Race
For profit, I think.
Race for Profit. Right. And the discussion she really has in there, at least that's one of the first places I really thought about it deeply, between property values and race, and the way, like, the depth through which this thing that we think of as like the real estate, these frameworks of real estate that, and property value and so on are just so inextricably tied to race, right? And such that like Blackness is actually antagonistic to property values, which again, like goes connects, to trespass as well. But yeah.
And even on the other side of that coin is that the mere presence of white people can be the thing that starts to shift neighborhoods towards increased value. And, you could think about that in a purely sociological way, but as someone who studies religion and theology, it's like, how can you not see a presumption of a kind of sacredness going on there? Like just in your presence of whiteness is something that literally can shift how we value things like monetarily. So it's wild. Yeah, I think it's actually clarifying to think in those terms, not to concede that it is truly sacred, but to understand that there's something about a claim to sacredness going on that helps us clarify why it sticks and why it's so powerful.
Yeah. There's this really great discussion, as we've started to kind of lay out, of these really foundational thinkers of political liberalism and early capitalist theory, thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Adam Smith. These are guys, they're all English except for, Smith is Scottish. They're philosophers from, the so-called Enlightenment era, foundational to political liberalism. So not necessarily like as people would think about like the Democratic Party or something like that, but really like the whole system of politics to a certain extent that we have in the Western world, which is, although in the United States we have two parties, but but yeah, the whole, that this kind of system of politics, and certainly the nation state form, the social contract, and capitalism. And so in many ways, we associate these folks with the secularization of Western society, or kind of, also the move away from, maybe like feudalism and monarchical societies more towards bourgeois or democratic societies, so-called. And obviously these forms have been imposed upon basically, this becomes the kind of basis of also the kind of international political framework of sort of in order for a country to be thought of as kind of normative and existing within the sort of, liberal world order, they kind of have to take on these certain characteristics for their state to be sort of recognized. Otherwise, there's some kind of, deviant to that order. This is imposed, of course, through colonialism, through imperialism, and through, the era of global capitalism, or also neoliberalism, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. It kind of spreads out to sort of everybody, with a couple of notable examples, of course. So one of the things that you focus on is how within these so-called secular institutions or theories, there are particular religious ideas that form a kind of bedrock of certain key concepts. And could you talk a little bit about some of those elements that you're looking at in the book, some of those areas specifically where these theorists thinking about, the state and capitalism and political liberalism are then actually not sort of elaborating something that's totally like a random philosophical, and it, of course, like in some sense, as I'm explaining this makes so much sense, right? Because it's like, of course, they would draw from, what preceded in certain ways, the ideas. But, I found it interesting because so often people think of this period as like this break, right, between the era where the ideas of how society was run were based on these kind of religious ideas, to an era where they were based on these secular liberal ideas. And one of the things that you're really showing is like that there are really key areas where all of these folks pull in certain things that have a deeply religious kind of background to them.
Mm-hmm. Well, to answer this or respond to this question, I think it's important to actually go a little further back into even the period in which, the Christian tradition specifically is coming into being. And even before that. So what I wanted to talk about is the fact that social and political and religious ideas have never been as easily separable as especially people today think that they are. this goes all the way back to, if you look at the sacred texts themselves, all throughout is the writers trying to make sense of some divine reality by reference to social and political and economic and cultural realities around them. And this is it's just the human condition. Like, we're finite and mortal, and we have what we have around us. And if you're trying to speak about something that transcends all of this, you have nothing else but the things around you to try to help people understand it's like this, or it's like that. It's like a judge, or it's like a king, or it's like a lord, or it's like a servant. These are already, from the beginning of these traditions, the people who help, forge them and write them down, at least the sacred text portion of them, are making sense of transcendent realities through immanent realities. And so it should be no surprise then that throughout all of the eras, the religious and the theological are always wrapped up with the political and the social and the economic, etc. Certainly in different ways at different times. So it's not one version of that relationship between, these seemingly separate phenomena. But all this to say that they're always connected. Now, when you get to Constantine and Charlemagne after him and others, you've got the bringing Christianity into the empire at its highest level so that it becomes a kind of imperial religion. Before that, it's a little bit more of an outlaw type of situation. But after that, it becomes very much part of the order. And then, throughout the ages, theologians are making sense of divine realities, and economists and legislators are making sense of social and economic realities, but they're doing so in conversation with one another. So, everything preceding our era in terms of discourse and public and ideas around the ultimate meaning of things and how we should run society, always drawing from each other. Literally to the point of like legislators and theologians and ecclesial figures like being regularly in conversation. So it's no surprise then that for like more than 1,000 years, if it's the case that people are making sense of God and society in and through each other's metaphors and ways of thinking and concepts, it's no surprise then that when there are some shifts, which there are shifts in, the modern era to, enough to call it a new era, that 1,000 years worth of interweaving of ideas will not just disappear overnight. So while it is true that there are shifts towards something maybe that resembles what people call secular, where religious ideas are not the foundation or anchor of all ideas, nevertheless, it's in the water enough in the way that people make meaning of society and order and politics and things like that, that they remain. And so I talked about for Locke, he's referencing biblical scripture. Hobbes is doing something similar. Interestingly, it's important to note that both Hobbes and Locke and Smith, to some extent, all giving a kind of, account of the origins of the order, of a kind of Western civilizational order that's emerging at that time. And so they're doing a kind of mythological work to begin with. They're providing a narration, an account of how this came to be. And it is far from just neutrally sociological or something. It's very much drawing from these mythological ideas. So for Hobbes, he's drawing from ideas of sin, people being self-centered and prideful, which creates a kind of disorder and disobedience, which requires then a kind of a moral god-like figure in the form of a state to come in and reestablish order in the midst of chaos. A very kind of like religious way of understanding the origins of civilization in an early form of capitalist sense. And, referencing it even so far as to titling his book after the biblical figure of the Leviathan who inspires fear and commands obedience in the book of Job. Adam Smith also drawing from biblical analogies and images and mythologies, and even, theorizing the idea of a kind of invisible hand, which is a kind of a godlike image of a kind of transcendent figure that guides human affairs in some way. And so while they are certainly a part of a shift away from religion as central in the ways that it was for 1,000 years, they're still drawing from the frames of reference and ways of making sense and meaning that informed an earlier era to make sense of the new political economies and societies that they're a part of helping to form and articulate. And a quick note is that I think for a lot of people, we don't have to tend to these dimensions of their thought as much because it's treated as like a remnant of an earlier era, or just like a source material that then influences a thing that becomes something secular. But I actually, I find Benjamin's take on capitalism as a religion pretty compelling, his little fragment where he's like, it's not just that capitalism finds in religion something to use for itself, but that it fulfills a religious function in the way that it structures things according to labor and reward and punishment and things like that. I'll even talk about, the Protestant Reformation transforms itself into capitalism as opposed to them being two separate things that maybe one influences the other. So, yeah, I think that to understand the kind of insistence upon maintaining capitalism against all challenges to it and the fact that it's held in the way that it has, I think we can understand a lot of that through, certain materialist analysis, and that gets us a really long way understanding it. But I think that also grasping the kind of sacred resonances of the system as articulated through those who are formulating it in its earliest stages can also help us understand why it remains with us in the way that it does, because there's this kind of transcendent grounding to it. So that's why, I think it's important to kind of attend to these dimensions of their thought.
Yeah, appreciate it. So, all right. So we talked about some of these so-called secular, philosophers here. So another set of figures that's very important to this book are some of the theologians, or, some cases they're like religious monks or religious philosophers. In particular, you look at John Calvin, Archbishop Anselm, and St. Augustine. Two of them, of course, the latter two are important Catholic figures, and Calvin obviously is super important to the kind of Protestant movement, Protestant Reformation. And, I found, in particular in this, I found the sections on sin and the meaning of the death of Christ, really interesting in the chapter. Obviously, like the last group of folks, there's a ton that we could do whole episodes on these people as individuals, but discuss some of the aspects of, particularly you use this term soteriology in the book, which is like, as I understood it, like theories of salvation, and how those kind of continue to structure policing and incarceration.
Yeah, so, to kind of go back to how I got here, just to touch on that narration from the beginning of our conversation again, I was reading part of my studies. So I did a PhD in religion and focused in systematic theology. And so when I was doing that, I was required to kind of read some of the so-called canon of theological texts over the millennia in the Christian traditions. And it's the same time of the emergence of the movements in response to police violence. And, I was already going into prisons a little bit with some friends who invited me in to be part of some little communities and book clubs and different things like that. So I'm reading, some of these figures as I'm doing some of that stuff, and I'm seeing all this language around, punishment and debt and subjection and sovereignty. Kind of like couldn't help but, draw some of these connections. So what I essentially identify in these three figures that you mentioned of Augustine and Anselm and Calvin is what I call a trajectory of Christian thought on sin and salvation. And the stuffy theological word for theories of salvation and sin is soteriology. And so what I identify as a thread through these figures, by the way, they live about 500 years apart, give or take. And so there's some historians who may kind of be a little suspicious about too closely unifying people who live that far apart from each other. But I do so in order to show continuity of thought. That really is a kind of a bedrock of some ideas that I think are still very much with us and structuring the world in which we live. And so what it comes down to, in short, is that the three of these figures, with their own divergence and difference between them, but still holding a lot in common, they theorize the problem of sin as the problem of humans who are corrupted, who live in a state of corruption. That corruption leads them to a state where they refuse proper subjection to a God characterized in terms of a kind of sovereign. Now, this is the way that they understand what sin is. Now, the subjection here is not subjection without purpose, like a kind of, like a ruthless kind of be subject to me just because, it's subject to a God who gives you everything you need, who provides for you, who loves you, etc. But nevertheless, it's still understood in terms of proper subjection to a God understood in a ways that resemble a sovereign. And so the thing, though, about that is not just that it's an offense to that God, but that it creates disorder, creates cosmic disorder. It even creates social disorder because, God creates the world according to this line of thinking with a certain hierarchy in place. And at the end of the day, the problem of sin for these figures is that it disrupts the divine human hierarchy, where humans are presuming too much power. They're presuming too much godlikeness, in a sense. Hence the notion of, Adam and Eve in that narrative, pursuing the knowledge of good and evil, kind of a godlike knowledge that throws everything off kilter, according to that story and that mythology. And so sin is about, fundamentally, for this line of thinking, is about a refusal to be properly subject, which you could also say is a kind of disobedience. And so if that's the problem in which humans exist, then Christianity is about a story that resolves that problem through salvation or redemption. And so for these thinkers, in various ways, again, there's distinctions between them. But at the end of the day, what's held in common between their line of thinking is that if sin is a problem of refusal to be properly subject, then salvation is a matter of restoring proper subjection, which in turn restores cosmic and social order, which is always hierarchical order, where God is God and humans are not. Not because God's a dictator, but because that's just the way that people get their needs met, is when they don't try to be God, but they let God be God, meet their needs that way. Don't, step out of that hierarchy, because that's where things get all messed up and disorder enters into the picture. And so I keep saying order and disorder. Those are terms that end up being really important, of course, with time and in the context of the present. But yeah, that's kind of what it comes down to. And also the other important layer here of how salvation gets accomplished is that there has to be either a payment that satisfies a debt or a punishment that satisfies a need for justice. And so these are kind of two parallel things that have to be accomplished in order for salvation to be secured and for order to be restored in a cosmic sense. So for Augustine, he talks about, I go into more detail than I need to go into here, but he basically says that sin holds humans captive. Captivity is also an important part of the understanding of what sin is. Sin is a kind of state of captivity. Augustine will even talk in terms of, when he's trying to explain what sin is in his book, The Confessions, which is a classic text in theology as well as beyond theology, he will talk about prisoners who seek to escape and slaves who seek to go free as an explanation for what humans in sin is like. So, in other words, he'll even say, the clanking of my chain that are of my own making deafen me to the sound of your voice. Like, he has got lines like that, where he essentially says that, humans put themselves in captivity to sin by their own choices. God doesn't put them there, but it's a kind of consequence, a natural consequence of their sin, captivity is. And so therefore salvation is a matter of getting back to the subjection that actually is good for them, for humans, and redeeming for them. And then they're released from captivity to sin, and instead are subject to a sovereign who cares for them. And in Anselm, he really brings in the debt component a lot, where he says that human sin, which is a state of corruption and disobedience to God, is really a matter of humans refusing to give the honor that is due to the sovereign God. We'll even have these wild lines about that one who's in sin is essentially stolen from God, kind of property idea, and that to reach a state of kind of being redeemed is to give that honor that is due, the property that is honor, that is due to God, back to God, that you stole from God. And so it's a kind of returning of stolen property idea that is a way of describing salvation. But he also will talk about payment of debt is important for him. To be in sin is to be indebted to God. You owe God something, like I just said, and therefore a payment of debt, covering that debt, brings you back into right relation to God. And Calvin will emphasize the punishment a bit more, though Anselm will also say there's two options for us humans. It's either payment of debt or punishment. Which is it going to be? And so it's kind of Jesus takes on the punishment, which pays the debt, which purifies humans of their kind of polluted state and also puts them in right relation that's no longer one of debt, but one of subjection to a sovereign. And then Calvin, will emphasize that punishment is the way out of the conundrum of human sin, that the Christ figure has to step in to absorb the punishment that God, as a just God, must deploy onto the guilty party, which is humans. And so Christ kind of steps in to take on that punishment, and that satisfies the justice of God in a kind of divine arithmetic of sorts. And that's what creates order again. And again, disorder is what's created by sin, and salvation is what creates order. And so I think that picking up on that trajectory within their thought was really important for me in understanding the discourse around order and disorder that emerges through modernity and into the present, especially as we talk about the disorder of disorderly peoples and criminality and things like that. And so, I argue that this line of thinking really provides the conceptual infrastructure that becomes material infrastructure, literally in the form of concrete walls and razor wire and handcuffs and things like that, where you have this sense of a state of corruption, which instead of just sin talk, it becomes criminality talk. So criminality is often seen over the centuries as a matter of the inherent personhood of criminal peoples, as opposed to just this or that action, but that's something about them that's criminal, i.e. like sinful on a political register that needs to be dealt with. And one of the phrases in the early periods of the formation of carceral institutions, which is, of course, the same time as the formation of capitalism as the order under which people live in Western civilization, you have this idea of masterless people to describe the early kind of vagrants and wanderers who were some of the first targets of police power. Masterless really tells us a lot in this frame, because it's literally like, in a more literal sense, they're talking about people who are not working for a wage, or who are able-bodied but not working for a wage, someone to whom they are subject, an employer, a master of some kind, but also masterless in the sense that one without a master, like a propertyless person, especially without a master, is somebody who is a threat to order. And so it's not just that they broke a law, but that they don't exist in a relation of subjection to someone. And that is what the threat is. It's an existential threat to actually society itself. So, some of the early vagrancy laws, in the context of England particularly, it's always written to describe the threat that the vagrant poses is a threat to all of our well-being, like collective commonwealth, like is always really high stakes stuff. Like our whole situation we have here as a society is under threat because of the presence of people who are not in a relation of subjection, which is a property relation, which is a labor owner relation, and which eventually becomes also a racial relation too, in different contexts. So that's a little bit about, there's a lot more that could be said, including like the idea that people who go through prison time pay their debt to society, this idea of payment of debt, and also that sin or criminality requires sacrifice of some kind for order to be reestablished. And so, yeah, I think we actually learn a great deal about what we have now when we attend to the kind of conceptual frame, which is based in a transcendent ideas, that can help us understand why common sense has become that in exchange for wrongdoing, one must be harmed in some way, or caged in some way, or captured in some way in order for things to be made right again. That calculus is so natural to so many of us. Like, why do we have these things? Because you got bad people out there and you got to correct them or keep us safe from them by containing their wayward impulses. And so there's this calculus that is what do we take for granted. I think tracing where it comes from can help us understand that it isn't necessarily self-evident and natural in the way that a lot of us presume that they are.
Yeah, for sure. As you were talking about that too, I mean, obviously I know a lot of people have talked about the concept of the penitentiary, and that connection to, kind of some of the Quaker origins and stuff like that. Like you mentioned being from near Philly, and I live in Philly area right now. And obviously we have Eastern State Penitentiary, which is now a museum for some of these concepts and stuff like that too. But even that term or that concept of a penitentiary and this notion of penitence, which very much refer to, these kind of sacraments of reconciliation or confession, and again, and we still do when, people are taken into custody or whatever, you're given an opportunity to confess, right? And that relationship between, a confession of a crime with a confession of a sin, and that this is a kind of way of restoring an order, and then also, of course, the penitence, including, time in prison, incarcerated, right, for many of the offenses. All right, so one of the philosophers I forgot to ask about in the previous question is Rousseau, and there's this passage I wanted to just quote at length for folks that you have in the book, and it says, I'll start it here. Because the sovereign is the living embodiment of the people's collective will for the good, obedience to the sovereign is effectively obedience to one's own will. As such, Rousseau writes, one who violates the state's laws literally, quote, ceases to be a member of his country. He even makes war upon it, end quote, which is in turn to consent to social or, when necessary, biological death. From this viewpoint, to be a member of society is to consent to the loss of certain freedoms by obeying the law in exchange for protection. Those who pridefully seek to exercise their own freedom without limit disobey the law and thereby antagonize the social order itself. By antagonizing sacred social order, the story goes, criminal enemies will their own captivity and death. As Augustine argued well before the modern era, the chains in which humans exist are chains of their own making. Those who refuse proper subjection to divine and political will for the subjection of a spiritual and material captivity that by nature and necessity follows as a consequence of such disobedience. So this kind of ties together the last couple questions we had about this group of philosophers, and you tie in Augustine here, so you're looking also at the theologians that we discussed a little bit, and you've laid a lot of this out, but I just wanted to see if there's anything else that you kind of wanted to add from this passage, and maybe anything from Rousseau, since we didn't talk about him in the previous question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that passage it's tying in a lot of different threads that I kind of weaving over the course of the book. And I think it's somewhat self-evident in the quote that, one of the things that I hear when you read that back most is this notion of this kind of acrobatics that political philosophy does to make the argument that when people are punished, that they're essentially willing it themselves. It's kind of an extension of like, you had it coming type of logic. But even more than you had it coming, it's like, you knew this was the outcome, and therefore you can't complain about what's happening to you when you have this consequence of severe punishment or being removed from the social body, social deaths, or even being outright eliminated in a biological sense. And that's one of the things I kind of like discovered that was most crucial, I feel like, in my research and in the book, is this idea that the state is only doing its job. You often hear, and I've heard like from the mouth of police themselves, agents of the state, I'm just doing my job here. That's kind of a classic line of state actors who are engaged at some stage in the process of eradication of people, that they're just doing their job. And this kind of seems like, I feel like I kind of started to pull on the thread of some of the theological and philosophical underpinnings of that idea that, to enter into society is to give up certain freedoms. This is kind of the political liberal, idea that you give up certain freedoms in order to enjoy protection from the state. So therefore, if you negate, the laws that secure that freedom, then you're consenting to giving up your freedom. It's just like a really bad deal for, to be a part of society. You have to agree that anytime you misstep or we are perceived as falling outside the bounds of proper orderliness, that you're essentially saying, okay, like I'm good with being cast out, absolutely now. And so it lets the state off the hook from any kind of responsibility. It lets its actors off the hook from any kind of responsibility, because it kind of is construed as, this is just the nature of things. Like these are the laws, almost like the laws of physics of political order. That if you do this, this happens, as if it were natural, as if it's always been that way and should always be that way. And so it's a fiction in that sense, and a guiding myth of this order. And the fact that, I hadn't necessarily seen a lot of people, I'm sure some do, but connecting like the early modern liberal philosophers, connected to these kind of ancient theorists, theologians. But it's pretty astounding, the resonance between Augustine saying that, if I'm in captivity, it's because I put myself there. And then Rousseau and others saying, if you're cast out, it's because you cast yourself out. So yeah, it really drives home this idea that the state is infinitely innocent and only its subjects can be guilty. And so it really sets us up for what we are living through in a lot of ways.
We've brought this up a few times, but you do come to the Lord's Prayer in the text, and, it was something at a certain point that I kind of, as I'm reading, I'm wondering if you're going to bring this in, because I start to make the connections, especially as you start to talk about trespass and what this means, and debt and what it means more within a religious context. I thought about the Lord's Prayer, and I did, when I was very little, I went to a Baptist church, but for most of what I remember, I was in United Church of Christ, or UCC. And, in general, like I've said this before, but I do think the UCC, as far as Christian churches in the United States at least, has one of the most progressive kind of programs and theologies, like by and large. But none of it is always all good. And this was one of the things that we did every Sunday. And I imagine everybody, pretty much every Christian in every denomination, has some version of this prayer that they often, will speak in unison as a whole congregation. And our version, we used debts in the UCC, but I think my mother was raised Catholic, and so I think when she would say it, she would often say trespasses. So I started thinking about, as I'm reading this book, the Lord's Prayer, which for you said it earlier, but for folks who don't know, yeah, it either goes forgive us our debts and forgive our debtors, or forgive us our trespasses and those who trespass against us. And it's, it's simple line of the prayer. As a kid, I thought about it in terms of like this basic idea of, forgiving things that we've done wrong, right? And let's forgive those who've done something bad to us, right? Kind of a like weekly prayer of forgiveness in a certain way, right? But I think the more interesting part of it is the way that these are very, these wrongs or these sins that we're talking about when we talk about debts and we talk about trespasses, and these are the specific words and terms that we use, is also how we think about how important these things are to the capitalist system when we think particularly about debt and credit is like a huge aspect of capitalism, but also this idea of property relations that we've already talked about that's so fundamental, and this notion of trespass against property, right? And actually, as we were talking about earlier too, about the idea of what gets termed as a criminal too, and the kind of the moral, the sinful and moral kind of weight that gets attached to these things is like also like how bankruptcy is considered such a moral blight on a person. I mean, obviously it impacts their ability to get credit and things like that, but it's like it's put in the newspaper, and like part of that is in theory because if there are debtors that are owed something, that they need to be notified and this kind of thing. But it is also this way of like sort of putting people on display before the town, right? Of like, these people are not of a high moral character. And that connection of the inability to repay debts and how that is seen as this really significant kind of moral harm or moral like mark on a person as not being that, again, to go back to that self-possessed individual, that individual who is something because they have that right to possess things. And so, yeah, we've talked about these things a little bit already, but if you want to say more about that and about the kind of the relationships there.
Sure. So, going back to the biblical origins of the Lord's Prayer, which of course becomes a tradition in its own right of Christians throughout the ages, but has its source in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew, which in both the Greek word that's used does refer to debt. I don't pronounce well necessarily, but aphiemi, I think, is the one in Matthew and Luke that refers to debt, but also in Matthew, it uses another word which refers more to a trespass or a sin. So the point in starting there is that trespass and debt are already kind of not interchangeable, but like closely related in the origin of this, tradition and this prayer and the religious tradition it's part of, even for the people who are writing these sacred texts themselves. So I think that's an important starting point, because a lot of people get hung up on, is it trespass or is it debt? A lot of different denominations, they'll use different ones, and different, Catholics versus Episcopal versus Protestant, there's different versions used. And so it's important to note that that the distinction between them is more a distinction in emphasis rather than a sharp distinction in the kind of thing they're talking about. They're talking about the same kind of thing, just with different emphasis. And there is a historian of Christian tradition who kind of posits that one way of understanding. Debt, I think, was used primarily for a long time, but at a certain point in the kind of early modern era, there's a bit of a shift so that both get used in different contexts. And this historian posits that, it may be that in more of the landed aristocracy, where there are translations being generated in proximity to those classes of people, that trespass gets emphasized, and where there's more of a merchant class, where there's translations being generated in proximity to those classes of people, that debt is maybe more emphasized, and that's maybe one way of explaining the usage of both. But at any rate, thinking about what they hold in common, if the problem of sin, again, according to this trajectory of thought that I've outlined, is the problem of a human being out of place in a divine human hierarchy, meaning like trying to presume too much power and not enough subjection to the sovereign God. If that is part of the problem of trespass, then, it can help us understand trespass in its kind of multiple registers as the word that's used for sin and for criminality. Because if out of place in a hierarchy on the sin side is what we're talking about, and out of place in like a spatial, like landed sense is what we're talking about in the kind of capitalist context. And you start to understand how out of placeness is the kind of the tie that binds these ideas. Out of place in a hierarchy, out of place physically, spatially, which, those who trespass in a physical, material, spatial sense are also trespassing against the hierarchy of a property owner and one who does not possess property. And so, yeah, I think that debt also is a word that is kind of should be understood as a cognate, I think, of trespass, and that a relation of debt is a relation that is very disproportionate in terms of power. So it's a hierarchical relation. And so I think it's important to retain that depth of meaning about out of placeness in relation to a hierarchy is what's the problem that's being described by these terms, debt and trespass, such that paying a debt is acknowledging that you've done that and getting back in line, so to speak. And acknowledging one's trespass is to acknowledge a property relation and a hierarchical relation based on a kind of possession of some kind. So I think that goes a long way. These theological ideas go a long way in explaining what we'll get into more around, the fact that these institutions of police and prisons from their genesis are concerned primarily with propertyless peoples who in one way or another show to the order that they are not willing to be subject in the ways that they are expected to be, and that the intervention of state violence is a matter of restoring that hierarchy in some way, getting people back in place, back in line, so to speak. And so, yeah, that's a bit about how the theological ideas, I think, are clarifying in terms of what we have today, which we can get into more.
Yeah, right on. So along with this notion of the debtor or the idea of the trespass, within the development of laws in capitalist societies, there becomes this emphasis on idleness and vagrancy. In this section, I also found the discussion of sex work in this context of kind of labor discipline really interesting. That the concern around sex work was primarily to do with the productivity of the workers who would be engaging in,
nocturnal something or other. I forget what the phrase is. They had a funny phrase for it. But
yeah, exactly. Would be partaking in sex work, right? And so there's a kind of history of laws around these things associated with capitalism and people being in this relationship really of workers. And there's a U.S. version, of course, that develops, which is very important specifically around vagrancy and idleness in response to the formal emancipation of enslaved people. And I thought about these things, kind of many times within the framework of capitalism and labor discipline. But, something I love for you to discuss a little bit, I found really interesting, and I think you alluded to it a little bit in that last answer too, is the notions around problems of people being, too free, right? Or these religious discourses around this idea that, again, you mentioned masterless earlier, but like this idea of people being too free or too liberated and needing to be reined back into the kind of order or discipline of the system.
Yeah, I was just reminded that I don't think I included in the book of this phrase, this kind of folk phrase of idle hands are the devil's playthings.
I remember this from some movie, maybe like, I don't remember, but one of those 90s movies, somebody constantly saying idle hands are the devil's work or idle hands are the devil's playthings. I've heard these, yeah.
Yeah, so there's, from the book of Proverbs in the Hebrew Bible, idle hands are the devil's workshop. And then I think Benjamin Franklin, he gets a lot of things attributed to him that he probably didn't say, but he apparently talked about devil's playthings. So anyways, yeah, I mean, it's this long-standing idea that has its roots, I think its roots really flourished the most in this early modern era, where idleness becomes the term to describe the trespasses, the criminality of people who are not laboring to produce someone else's wealth, to put it plainly. So one of the interesting things I think is important to name up front is just how much this is like a gaslighting situation, to use common parlance, of like wealthy people who do very little to get their wealth, accusing people of doing very little as being the source of all of our problems. It's just one of those kind of, really twisted ways that capitalism convinces us that those who are in fact the most idle among us are the ones with the most wealth, and everybody else who is taking years off of their life laboring and whatnot, are struggling to survive. And so, idleness becomes the kind of watchword for the ruling classes and for public discourse in the early modern era, to signify people, specifically people who are able-bodied, as they would say, but unwilling to work. And so instead they would, allegedly wander and beg for money. And so people who were caught idling, meaning they clearly presented as people who could work if they chose to, but chose not to, these are the vagrancy laws are written for them. People who do this are, like, at certain points in time were put to death, if not publicly reprimanded and wounded physically, like with weapons and different torture devices, because, and it always said, they are a threat to our common well-being. And so, idle also has this, as you mentioned, should be closely understood in relation to this refusal of subjection to a sovereign of some kind. And, the sovereign of the state, the sovereign of the owner, the sovereign of God are all kind of like of a piece, related to each other. And so to be idle is not just to not do something, it's to choose to refuse to be subject in the way that order demands. And so therefore it's to introduce disorder, and it's to pose a little existential threat to society. And this is the logic from an early era. And, we see the remnants of this in discourses around the laziness of poor folks, like an unwillingness to work. You'll have texts throughout the 18 and 1900s of people, ruling class writers and commentators, talking about, who are the criminals? They are those who are unwilling to work. So there's always this kind of connection between criminality and idleness, because, right order is understood in terms of those who are disciplined to labor, who have the discipline to labor for their own wage, which, as we know, is ultimately a means of creating wealth for others. And so, idleness is really one of these terms that has some theological resonance, some political and economic resonance, and really about a power relation that is somebody who allegedly wants to be more equal than they should be. Vagrancy laws originate, I think some of the first ones were like in the 1300s, maybe 14, 15, and then they really take off in the 15, 16, 1700s. And they kind of get retooled in the context of, colonial America to deal with the problem of enslaved people when they are not at work. And so, the vagrancy laws that were introduced, kind of a 2.0 version of them, were introduced in a lot of the colonies and in states to contain what planters and that class understood as the threat posed. Once you get an existential threat posed by enslaved people who are not laboring. And this gets into this point about, being a little too free. There's this idea, the very white supremacist and really racial capitalist, white supremacist capitalist idea that people of African descent are literally not made to enjoy the freedoms that people of European descent have. So this gets back into the self-possession idea that, Europeans have the rationality and self-discipline to kind of be self-controlled and moving rationally in the world and making decisions rationally and whatnot, which of course, rationality is just the cover for mass exploitation and violence, it turns out. But, the counter of that is people who, if left unrestrained, pose a threat to everybody. So, the idea that the scale of the races with whiteness at the top, people of African descent being at the bottom, they're not made to govern themselves or others. They're made to labor for others, and that's actually beneficial to them. If they're not in a master-slave or like owner-laborer relation, then they will suffer because they will be in a context that's not disciplined enough for them, and they won't have the guardrails to keep their wayward impulses in line. Like, this is the logic. And the same goes even for, poor folks of European descent as well, that if they're not in some relation of owner-laborer, then they are idle in some sense and a little too self-determining. And we know, according to the logic of, European property ownership, that, which is a patriarchal logic as well, that idle hands are the devil's playthings. And so it's this idea that based in a theological sense, that those who are not, again, in this relation of hierarchy that God requires for the benefit of all, again, mind you, then disorder is unleashed. And that last point about for the benefit of even the subject is important as well. In these theological systems, again, the subjection to a divine sovereign is a subjection that is always seen as beneficial to the human. So it's salvific for them. It meets their basic needs. And, from a God who loves them, even if it's a sovereign God, like a king-like God. But this idea that, in a kind of lay speak, like, this is good for you type of patronizing way of talking down to people in a class society and in a race and class society is, we find the parallels and even maybe perhaps the roots of them in these theological systems where being subject and even being punished is in the interest of the person who is subject and being punished, because it puts them in the place that they were made for in the hierarchy. If they tried to go too high up the ladder, they would suffer, and so would everyone else. And so this is kind of the self-fulfilling kind of like logic of these systems, which has its, again, theological roots.
Yeah, appreciated. So one of the things, and this comes up particularly among like friends of mine that organize in abolitionist spaces and things like this, is the, kind of some of the limitations of the various explanations or discourses we have around mass incarceration. And a lot of people have done really good work around this. I mean, there's so much that, especially in the last 20 years that people have spent writing and thinking about these things. And specifically, there's a lot of good work that's done around Black and brown populations and understanding the U.S. system within the context of racial capitalism, the history of enslavement, also, different contradictions within the capitalist system itself. But there's less work that's really done around white folks and why it is that, obviously we know that it disproportionately targets Black folks, Indigenous folks, Latino folks, Latinx folks, even certain groups of like South Asian people and stuff like that, that there's a lot of disproportionality in the system. And so as a result, often, there's not as much time dedicated to white people within the system, even though they constitute, hundreds of thousands of people. And so where I grew up, most of the people that I knew, in fact, all the people that I knew that were incarcerated for some reason or another when I was growing up, it's changed since then, but were white folks, and obviously it was a very predominantly white area, but there wasn't really any language there either of how to talk about that. Like, what was available was often similar to some of the things you've laid out, but it's like these logics of kind of disposability and shame that existed where, he really didn't discuss it. Like, I think it was very much seen as a moral failing of that individual, and that it was never, the state was never interrogated, interestingly, within the white community around why the white people that went into prison went into prison. You know, it was always something that was wrong with them. And it was also a shame, I would say, because I had some friends growing up, their father went to prison when they were like in elementary school with me. And, nobody talked about it. It was a huge impact on all of their lives, But I remember also just like a communal kind of shame of that family, like not necessarily like spoken that much, except if it was like, oh, we should invite one of them to a birthday party or something like that, And anyway, I think the book does a really good job about talking about the logics that are underpinning the role of the system in targeting certain white people, so-called white people, right? And the function that this serves. So talk a little bit about this.
Yeah. No, in my own kind of experiential background that informs the book, I mentioned before, I think that I worked for 5 years as the editor of a street newspaper here in Nashville called The Contributor. And, in the course of that time, as a person on staff position to help people tell their stories through writing and poetry and different things, I would often hear folks telling me about, being harassed by the police for, life-sustaining functions, sitting, sleeping, standing, using the bathroom, etc. And certainly a number of those unhoused folks and formerly unhoused folks were Black and other non-white folks, but a great portion of them were white folks. And, my first kind of exposure to criminalization kind of up close was through relationship with some of these folks. And so I was positioned from the start to kind of be attentive to the fact that it was not strictly not exclusively a racial phenomenon, in the sense that we think of racial today, of in other words, like just a phenomenon of the criminalization of Black folks, but that, to be poor and dispossessed in one way or another is to be subject to criminalization regardless of your racial status. And so, when I encountered this idea of racial capitalism, actually, and, read Robinson and, his various interlocutors, and Robin Kelley and Ruth Gilmore and others who really make this point that the differentiations within Europe at the beginning of capitalism, Robinson wants to call those racial or racialist, as he'll call it. And I think that trips up some people somewhat, that you could talk about different, seemingly like what we would call today different white people as like racially distinct from one another in some regard. Of course, their point that they're making is that, racial differentiation, what Gilmore will call group differentiated vulnerability to premature death, as something that happened between Europeans. The point there is that, capitalism has always been racial in some regards. And even before people of African descent entered the scene through colonial capture. And so Gilmore has a great line, I don't have it exactly in front of me, but this idea that even within Europe, there were people whose descendants would eventually become white who were, being differentiated from one another in ways that approximated what we might understand to be racial. Even if I argue in the book, I kind of have some caveats around Robinson's analysis that like the racial, and I read, gets absolutized through systems of colonialism and enslavement, when whiteness kind of gets articulated in opposition to Blackness and other forms of non-whiteness. But nevertheless, the point is that within Europe, there are these kind of differentiations that approximate a racial. And, what this means is that the first subjects of police power are dispossessed European people. So, if we're thinking historically, arguably the first people who are subject to these proto-police forces, police power of the state to bring people into subjection, to force them to do what the ruling class wants them to do. There are people who would become white, who would be understood as white later. And then even, in the American so-called colonial context, you've got the development of notions of, white trash and kind of like of discardable people of European descent. And Nancy Eisenberg writes this book, White Trash, that she has a line about how, I think it's from her book, that John Locke, wrote the Carolina Constitution, and she calls it a kind of like a manifesto of class war against poor European folks, many of them formerly indentured servants. And there's even this phrase that comes up in some of that language that Locke and others helped put down on paper there's a term called renegados, which they would use as a kind of a term of derision to refer to the kind of poor, what would later become white trash, the idea of white trash people in like the Northern Carolina colony, which would become North Carolina. And renegados refers to, on the one hand, lawless, or on the other hand, irreligious or immoral. There's this kind of double, like criminal and immoral designation for these people. And so they, of course, too, also become subjects of police power in a more intense way, as police power is also developing in that context as an anti-Black institution as well. There's a historian that I quote in the book, Neeson, who talks about the fact that wealthy enclosers who, were part of the movement to enclose large swaths of formerly common lands in the European and English context particularly, that they would loathe commoners with what he calls a xenophobic intensity. And these are all people, again, who will become white with time. But there's this kind of xenophobic intensity, or kind of a notion of a foreigner or someone who doesn't belong or is out of place in some sense. And, this, coming through the theorists that I worked through and into the American context, thinking about how I mentioned before, how Du Bois will talk about how kind of allude to the fact that while white folks, people becoming white who are of lower class status, were still brought into whiteness, but really only in part, because there were still limitations on the powers and privileges that they became inheritors of. And that's really where property comes in for me, is that property status is kind of the crucial marker, so that among folks called white, those who have property and those who do not, the difference between them almost approximates a racial difference, if we want to think about it that way. And so, Eva Baldwin talks about a quote of how I know white folks aren't going to, do any good for me because they don't even take care of their own. Like they had white kids dragging carts to the mines before they got to me. It's what he says. And so it's like, there's all this evidence that, whiteness is never as simple as white-skinned people, because you can belong to whiteness in part, but not in full. Full whiteness, essentially, I'm arguing, is reserved for property, and particularly patriarchal people fitting within patriarchal structures. So particularly men, though not exclusively. And so, another thing I would say, and I kind of learned a lot from Kelly Hernandez's work on this too, that this history in the kind of westwards manifest destiny expansion towards what would become California and Los Angeles, where there's this tradition of poor, dispossessed, wandering, vagrant, so-called hobo folks who would come to LA and seasonally for work, but who otherwise were kind of riding the rails and living in what some regard as like homosocial kind of like communities. And, there's a historical record, as Hernandez shows, about how some of the jailers and sheriffs and those kind of carceral entities in LA, in a kind of colonial LA, settler colonial LA, were building stockades for these poor folks of European descent to come, and essentially saying, like, we're ready for them. Let them come in for their work. We've got this jail ready for them. And so in that context, white folks, again, subject to the state violence in the form of police and jails. And then also, you've got poor white women who are, when criminalized, the basis of their criminalization is distinct from that of Black women, in that Black women are traditionally and have traditionally been and still today are seen as having a bit more like inherent waywardness, almost like ontological, like the part of their makeup and their being perceived from the white view and the state ruling class view as like more irredeemably fallen and criminal and disposed to criminality, or more likely to be disposed to it. Whereas for white women, kind of as you said, in your narration of the folks in your community growing up, there's a sense of shame and like that they've really fallen from grace because they were in a state of grace perhaps before, but to fall into a criminal status, which is always connected to poverty in some way or to some abnormality of some kind, according to the normativities articulated by, ruling class order. Angela Davis will talk about how those women were often regarded as closer to Black women, like more identifiable with Black women than with white women of property, and kind of tethered to property and status through the men that they were married to. And so, there's all these kind of examples of how the police power has really always made unpropertied folks of European descent subjects in one way or another. And there is this idea that white men in particular are called to a kind of this notion of white manhood is this aspiration and a standard for being utterly independent, self-possessing, getting back to Locke, property owning, and kind of in charge of your household in some way. And so, you think about these itinerant white folks in the Western settler colonial context who are just wandering about, not the head of a household, not owning property. They're breaking all of these standards to which white men in particular are calls. And then for white women, you're called to be pure and passive. And so if you're engaged in something associated with lower classes and therefore racialized lower classes, then you're failing your kind of standard of white womanhood. And so though distinct from the basis of criminalization in some ways of Black folks and folks of color who are criminalized, there is a shared experience of being made subject. And so I think that I've always thought that it's been important to not lose sight of the fact that the systems that we still live with today still capture an immense amount of white folks. And, just by sheer numbers, the majority still, though proportionally Black people are the most highly criminalized and incarcerated in their share of the population. But yeah, nevertheless, if we lose sight of the fact that whiteness doesn't have to just mean white skin, but that it's more an expression of like godlike transcendence and power and possession, then we will leave a bunch of folks unregarded, which would be a tragic thing to do.
Thank you so much for that. Appreciate it. So we'll wrap there, and then we'll do a part 2. So thanks for this, Andrew.
Of course, yeah, happy to do it.
Bye.